My name is Robinson Crusoe. I was born in York, England in 1632. Even as a child, I was adventurous and dreamed of becoming a sailor one day. My father opposed this idea, convinced that this vocation would lead me on the road to ruin. Despite all his warnings, I decided to go to sea and traveled the oceans of the world. And while I came close to losing my life on several occasions, I never lost my enthusiasm for sailing. One day, in September of 1659, I had the misfortune of booking a passage on a ship bound for Guinea. In the middle of the journey, a wild tempest arose. The crew was filled with terror. We were battered by the wind and pounded by the violent waves of the raging sea. Our vessel was finally driven onto a coastal sandbank. We had just enough time to launch a rowboat when suddenly an enormous wave crashed over the boat. We were all swept overboard and separated. My name is Robinson Crusoe. I was born in York, England in 1632. Even as a child, I was adventurous and dreamed of becoming a sailor one day. My father opposed this idea, convinced that this vocation would lead me on the road to ruin. Despite all his warnings, I decided to go to sea and traveled the oceans of the world. And while I came close to losing my life on several occasions, I never lost my enthusiasm for sailing. One day, in September of 1659, I had the misfortune of booking a passage on a ship bound for Guinea. In the middle of the journey, a wild tempest arose. The crew was filled with terror. We were battered by the wind and pounded by the violent waves of the raging sea. Our vessel was finally driven onto a coastal sandbank. We had just enough time to launch a rowboat when suddenly an enormous wave crashed over the boat. We were all swept overboard and separated. Watching the boat tossed in the foaming waves, I realized that I had just escaped death. I fought against the raging sea, hanging onto a reef and holding my breath. I finally reached the shore. I was alive. But alas, I was alone on this desolate shore, without water, weapons, or help of any kind. Although I was exhausted, I decided to seek shelter as night was approaching, and I feared I might fall prey to wild beasts. Finally, I found a thick, bushy tree. I climbed up and spent the night hidden in its branches. The next day, the storm had abated and the weather was clear. I was feeling much better and wanted to explore the shore a little. Walking along the beach, I discovered to my astonishment that my ship had run aground here, set on her keel less than a mile from the shore. Thanks to the tide, she had been tossed up and drifted towards the coast. I decided to go aboard as soon as possible to salvage provisions, tools, and anything else of possible use. I waited until noon when the tide was low and the sea calm. It was extremely hot. I swam for a long time. Once alongside the ship, I had to find a way to heave myself up onto the deck, but I could see nothing to hang on to. I slowly swam around the vessel, looking for a solution. On closer inspection, I saw a rope that would permit me to climb up onto the vessel, and I reached the forecastle. The ship was wrecked, the hold full of water, but the provisions beneath the bow were dry. I was starving. I hurried to the storeroom, filled my pockets with biscuits, and drank some rum before going to work. I had to build a raft to carry as many provisions and tools ashore as possible. I gathered all the wood that could be useful and bound the planks solidly together. My raft was ready to be loaded. Back on shore, I embarked on a reconnaissance mission. Climbing up the surrounding hills, I discovered many species of animals and plants unknown to me. On reaching the summit, I realized I was the sole survivor of the shipwreck, on a hostile island way out in the middle of the ocean. This discovery plunged me into despair. I unloaded my raft and barricaded myself in for the night. I had to salvage as many provisions as possible before the ship sank forever. For days, I devoted myself fully to this task, loading and unloading my raft. One morning, after a tempestuous night, I awoke to find that the ship had vanished. Fortunately, I had already gathered the essentials for survival. I found myself in the company of 2 cats and a dog from the ship who had miraculously survived its foundering and swum ashore. From then on, I concentrated on building a residence. First, I had to find a piece of land that met several criteria. I needed a place protected from the sun with a source of fresh water, yet hidden enough to protect me from wild animals. The place needed to overlook the ocean because, in hopes of being rescued, I wanted to be able to watch for vessels on the horizon. I finally chose to settle on a small plain at the foot of a large hill. I chopped down some large trees, sharpened them into stakes, and drove them into the ground in 2 rows. I reinforced the fence with struts and stored provisions and munitions there. To protect myself from the rain, I built a double tent and covered it with tarpaulin canvas salvaged from the ship. Once my fortress was complete, I started to dig into the rock and made, behind my tent, a cave to use as a larder. Day by day, my life became more and more routine and organized, although there was still much to be done. One of my first challenges was to keep track of time. I drove a cross-shaped post into the ground near the shore and marked the date of my arrival. Every day, I cut a notch into the post. Every week, I cut a notch twice as long as those for the days. And every first day of the month, I cut a deeper mark. Thus, I created a calendar on which I counted the days, the months, and soon the years. Once the fortress had been completed, I decided to make some basic furniture using planks and tools from the boat. I started with the essentials, a table and chair. After several attempts, a chair took shape, but it was not to my liking, and I dismantled it several times, developing both patience and skill. I was on my way to becoming an excellent craftsman. One day, looking for something to use as a pouch, I found a bag that had contained grain for feeding poultry aboard the ship. I shook it free from dust. A month later, I noticed stalks sprouting from the soil. At first, I took them to be unknown plants. I was astonished to see them slowly bearing husks of perfect green barley. I carefully gathered the grain, which was identical in every respect to European barley. On the 16th of April, 1660, a terrible earthquake rocked the island. I assumed that the hour of my death had come. I was busy near my tent when the ground inside my cave began to crumble. Terrified, I did not know where to take refuge. The fright of being buried alive made my blood run cold. Everything I had achieved with my own hands threatened to collapse. I was going to be a helpless witness to the destruction of my domain. I ran to take shelter on the other side of the wall to escape the stones tumbling down on me. The ocean raged with the storm. After 3 tremors that seemed to last forever, silence returned. I stayed seated on the ground, shattered. I did not dare to return to my cave. I thought back to my father's words and warnings. I had escaped death once again. The earthquake shattered my routine. Despite the strong attachment I felt to my house, I resolved to move to a less dangerous place. But I was soon distracted from my thoughts. I saw one morning that my ship had reappeared. The tremors had washed her back up on shore. I began to pull the vestiges of her skeleton to pieces as quickly as possible. During the rainy season, I fell seriously ill, delirious with a violent bout of marsh fever. I became too weak to hunt, and soon lacked even the strength to eat and drink. As I drifted in and out of consciousness, I thought of the peaceful life I could have led in England, and of my father, who had always advised me against going to sea. I had spurned his words and arrogantly disobeyed him. Only a miracle could save me from this island of despair. The idea of dying in such a deplorable state, abandoned by everybody, including God, overwhelmed me. One evening, still racked with fever, I recalled that one of the chests of the vessel was full of medicinal plants known in Brazil for their soothing properties. I decided it was worth the risk. I soaked the plants in rum, and thanks to this mixture, I regained my strength and was able to resume exploring my island. Near a brook, I discovered a meadow bordered by cocoa plants and lemon trees. Melons and grapes grew in abundance. I took some bunches and hung them in a tree to let them dry in the sun. The place seemed ideal. I decided to establish a second camp here, my summer residence. By now, I had reached the first anniversary of my landing on the island. I had 2 houses, one on the coast to watch for the arrival of ships, and the other in the countryside for farming. My life was more sedate than usual. I barely left the house. I wrote my diary, dozed in my hammock, and nourished myself with the fruit and grapes I had dried. After the rainy season, the time was right for sowing my harvest of barley and corn. However, over the following months, there was such a drought that no seeds came to maturity, and I had to wait for a new season. From then on, I learned not to let myself be surprised by changes in the weather. I learned how to forecast the dry season, the rainy season, and the best times for sowing and harvesting. I continued to explore the island. One day, I reached a remote part, a kind of dense and flowering savanna. Parakeets and parrots filled the air. I decided to tame one of these birds to have as a companion. I even hoped, with a little effort, to teach it how to speak. I captured a young parrot by knocking it out with a stick. Next, I discovered a vast beach covered with turtles and populated with many animals. This region was more fertile than mine, but I did not wish to leave the corner of the island to which I'd grown accustomed. On the way back, I made the mistake of cutting through the woods. The sky became shrouded in mist and darkened the dense forest. I was lost. I wandered a long time looking for a landmark. It took me days to find the shore again. I was saved. I could not express how happy I was to come back home after so many nights spent in the forest. I felt secure in my palace, and I savored the sweetness of a well-deserved rest. For a whole week, I devoted myself to making a cage for my new companion, Poll the parrot. To my greatest delight, the bird learned how to say a few words. My little family had grown to include Poll, my 2 cats, and the dog from the ship. Dreaming of real bread, I set upon baking as my next project. First, I I had to protect my corn from natural predators. I built an enclosure around my seeds with a hedge to keep out hares and the goats. I had barely finished when the birds threatened my crops. I decided to erect a scarecrow and kill some of the thieves. My strategy succeeded. Not a single bird came to peck at my corn after that. Next, I needed to make some containers because I possessed nothing in which to mix and bake my dough. So before I could become a baker, I had to become a potter. I built myself an oven using bricks. I learned how to work clay, but this new profession proved difficult. I confess it took me a long time to learn, and I sacrificed a great many plates. After patiently laboring for a year, I had gathered together all the essential materials. My harvest was large enough to allow me to use one part for making my bread and the other for sewing. Finally, I prepared the dough. I covered it with an earthenware dish and set it in the middle of the fire's glowing embers. The dish served as a heat conductor, protecting the bread while it baked. Success! Try as I might to get used to my loneliness, I still dreamt of returning to England. One day, during my exploration of the island, I saw land way off in the sea, about 20 leagues away. Land! I thought only of reaching its shores, whatever the dangers were, even if this land were infested with cannibals. I decided to build a canoe. I cut down a cedar tree, hewed it, and shaped the bottom of the hull. Then I carved out the inside and planed it smooth. I was very proud of my work. I now had a large canoe capable of carrying a considerable amount of cargo. It was only when the time came to launch it that I discovered my mistake. My canoe was too heavy. It was impossible to move. I considered building a canal to let it float to the sea, but I calculated that this would take me about 12 years. In the end, I had to abandon any hope of using this canoe. I refused to give up the possibility of reaching the other shore. I buckled down to building a second canoe, this time fitted with a mast and sail. Alas, now I had built a craft too light for the open ocean. My project had to be delayed again. But I decided to take advantage of my canoe and sail around the island for the first time. Rounding the point of the island, I was suddenly swept away from the shore by a violent current. Helplessly, I drifted a great distance from my island, without being able to escape the current. I despaired of ever seeing the island again. I was exhausted. A southerly wind sprang up, my only chance of salvation. I put all my strength into trimming the sail and changed my heading for the north. My maneuver succeeded. I swore to myself that I would never use this boat again, put it away in a creek, and walked back to my summer place. I had now been on this island for 11 years. With no rivals, I called myself lord of the entire country. I had become skillful in most crafts and imaginative in getting whatever I needed. For example, in order to acquire a flock, I set traps and managed to capture some goats. Within 2 years, I had 43 animals in my possession. Thus, I could eat butter and cheese. Sometimes I was overcome by a sense of despair, but I tried to fight it by considering all the things Providence had given me. I missed nothing, and I was even surrounded by a little family. My dog, who was getting a bit old, my 2 cats, and Paul, my parrot, who was now quite good at talking. I became used to my solitude, living a routine and peaceful existence. Little did I know that my life was about to change dramatically. One day, to my astonishment, I discovered a footprint in the sand. The sight terrified me. I turned around, looking everywhere, but saw and heard nothing. Frightened, I ran back to my fortress and barricaded myself in for 3 days and 3 nights. I couldn't sleep, for my head was filled with strange and fantastic thoughts. I finally came to my senses. The footprint must belong to the inhabitant of a neighbouring island. Perhaps the man happened to land here and, judging the place to be too wild, had left it at once. There was undoubtedly little chance of him returning. Nevertheless, I began to organise my defence. I constructed another rampart around my fortress, reinforced with pieces of wood, rigged with muskets to serve as cannons. I planted thousands of trees that, after 6 years, formed an impassable forest. Nobody could ever imagine that anyone lived within. I decided to divide up my herd and station them in different parts of the island, because I did not want to take the risk of having an entire flock destroyed if some disaster occurred. It was necessary for me to be able to quickly restock my flock from the animals which would have been saved. I started to look for places to hide my goats. One day, during my quest, I thought I saw a ship on the ocean. But without my telescope, I wasn't certain. I promised myself that in the future, I would always carry it with me. Arriving at the foot of the hill some hours later, I was horrified to discover a pile of human remains. Feet, hands, skulls, and other bones lay scattered all over the place. A hideous, cannibalistic feast had taken place. I nearly fainted before this horrid spectacle, and vowed to avenge these deaths, to kill the savages who had committed such an atrocity. Yet, as I thought more about this episode, I was stricken with doubt. Of course, I wanted to punish these savages, but did I have the right to judge their deeds? Were their crimes more blameworthy than those of my fellow countrymen who had massacred thousands of Indians? Disturbed by these thoughts, I abandoned my vow of revenge. Still, I became more cautious than usual. To cook my meals, for example, I started using coal to reduce the amount of smoke produced, and thus be less visible. I made coal by burning wood under a layer of humid soil in the forest. One day, while I did this, I noticed 2 red eyes at the back of a cave, shining out in the darkness. I bravely illuminated the cave with a torch of burning wood. These 2 eyes belonged to an old goat, lying ill on its side. The poor animal was no devil. I explored the cavern, which made an ideal place to store my weapons and powder. The cave could also be my secret hideout if the cannibals ever came back to the island. I lived in constant fear of their return, even though I had lived on the island for 23 years without being particularly worried. But one morning, at daybreak, I was surprised to see the glow of a fire on the seashore near my fortress. Terrified, I hid behind a rock with my telescope to observe the barbaric rituals of their feast. I hastily organized my defenses, but some hours later they took to the high tide and returned to sea, leaving behind the remains of their horrific meal. 2 years passed before they returned again, this time dragging 2 prisoners with them. As on the previous occasion, I hid. Suddenly, one of the prisoners escaped. He ran directly towards me. 2 cannibals followed. I stood up, raised my rifle, and shot at them to cover the flight of the poor runaway. I had just saved this man's life. I had a companion at last. I called my new companion Friday, in remembrance of the day of our first encounter. I taught him my language and how to live according to my customs, which surely must have seemed strange to him at the beginning. However, he quickly adapted to life on the island, the food I gave him, and even the garments I made for him. He was very proud of these: canvas breeches, a blouse, and a cap made of the skin of a hare. A real masterpiece. For a long time, Friday remained very impressed with my rifle. He considered the weapon to be an instrument of death with terrifying power because it could strike down living beings from afar. He dreaded it the way he might fear the wrath of a god. But when I taught him how to use it, he was no longer afraid and went hunting with me. I remained somewhat on my guard, however. Years of solitude had made me mistrustful. In the beginning, I took certain precautions. I forbade him to approach my house because I feared he would steal my property. At night, I made him sleep between the ramparts, and I took the ladders away to prevent him from entering my territory. My suspicions, however, were unfounded. Friday became as loyal to me as a son to a father, and I realized that he would never betray me. After some time, we became close friends. Friday quickly learned how to grind corn, knead dough, and bake it. He carried out everything I asked him to do in good spirits, and always helped me with my daily tasks. He helped me to clear, enclose, and plough new fields, too. These agricultural tasks took up a great deal of time. Now that there were 2 of us, we needed to increase our corn and bread production. The 3 years I lived on the island with Friday were the happiest times of my life. Finally, I had someone to talk to. He brought my enforced loneliness to an end. I told him stories about my adventures and of my landing on the island and everything I had experienced. My friend understood me. He now spoke the language I had taught him well enough so that he could recount with pleasure everything I wanted to learn about his country and the neighbouring lands.
Watch. Feather. A feather. Feather.
Be quiet. Be quiet.
Watch where I pluck feathers from, Paul.
I learned from him that 4 years earlier, his tribe had saved a group of Spanish sailors from drowning. They had fraternized with the natives and had never left the land in which they had been made so welcome. The prospect of joining these sailors made me wild with joy. Friday, too, was impatient to get back home, and although I had doubts about the ocean crossing, he was clear about which course we should take, assuring me that the wind was always favorable there. We built a wooden canoe, and when it was finished, waited for the arrival of the dry season, that is to say, November and December, before carrying out our plan. Yet once again, fate intervened. One morning, the cannibals landed with 2 more prisoners. One seemed to belong to Friday's tribe. The other appeared to be a sailor. We had to do something quickly to free them. We lay in ambush and suddenly launched our attack, shooting at the cannibals. Panic-stricken, the luckiest ones managed to flee with their canoes. The others were killed. Only the prisoners remained on the shore, safe and sound. The Spanish sailor confirmed Friday's accounts. 16 of his countrymen lived on the neighboring coast and, despite their peaceful life, dreamed of one day returning to Europe. I charged the Spaniard with returning to his fellow men and bringing them back to my island. If they accepted my command, I was willing to help them with their plans by supplying them with the necessary materials to build a new ship. He promised me that he would fulfill his mission and went to get the crew with my canoe. 8 days later, a ship steered a course, heading for my island. I left my island on the 19th of December, 1686, 28 years, 2 months and 19 days after my landing. The vessel that dropped anchor on this day was not the one belonging to the Spaniards, but to English mutineers. I managed to take the command and to win the crew to my cause of getting back to England. I took Friday with me, without waiting for the return of the Spanish sailors, from whom I had heard nothing. I later learned that these men had finally reached my island and were still living there. Back in Europe, I recovered all my riches, but my passion for traveling was never satisfied. Whenever I could, I set sail in search of new lands. I had many other adventures, but none as extraordinary as the one on the Island of Despair.
Where are you? That's it! Hurrah! Oh! Nice and George. Must be the island. Get your breath. Oh, poor Robinson, one more what and I'll stuff you.